Assalamu alaikum. On behalf of the People's Coalition on Food Sovereignty, the Arab Group for the Protection of Nature, the Arab Network for Food Sovereignty, and CPDE Working Group on Conflict and Fragility, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to today's online forum on just grounds, land, food and rights amid crisis and conflicts. It's always inspiring to be joined by driven and like-minded organizations from all across the world, especially in such an important date celebrating the International Human Rights Day, to exchange knowledge and experiences on one of the most challenging issues facing the world today. Let me start by saying that one cannot deny the influence that the Ukraine-Russia war has had on the global food crisis, given that they are two of the biggest agricultural producers globally. Food prices have skyrocketed as a result of supply chain disruptions, a global grain shortage, and an increase in energy costs. But let us not forget that the global food crisis has been on the rise long before the outbreak of this particular war. Wars, sanctions, and colonial occupations, instigated and covered up by the world's most elite nations, continue to be one of the greatest obstacles to ending hunger and achieving food security, especially in the global south. Conventional forms of wars have transformed into territorial disputes, civil wars, and proxy conflicts. Occupations use government-sanctioned policies and practices of annexation and usually have long-term manifestations, and sanctions cause widespread collateral damage to human rights in the target country. These systemic tactics threaten people's rights to self-determination and force them out of their land. In the first months of 2022, the number of forcibly displaced people surpassed 100 million for the first time ever. It is 4 times higher than the number of the refugees in 2010. The number of refugees has reached an all-time high with 27 million refugees worldwide, 85% of which are hosted by developing countries. Although these conflicts are strategically manufactured by superpower nations for their own gain, developing nations are left to suffer the consequences. Conflict in all of its forms leads to drastic breakdowns in food systems and livelihoods, and damages people's rights to food. It's estimated that 60% of the people affected by hunger live in conflict-affected countries. While 139 million people experience acute food insecurity due to conflict, representing 75% of people facing acute food insecurity from all causes. And finally, 10 out of the 13 main food crises in the world are driven by conflict. In these conflict zones, a simple plate of food can cost more than a day's wage. What is more concerning is that using food as a weapon in conflict is becoming more and more popular. The destruction of farms, crops, and food supplies is being employed as a military tactic, since the value of food is as important in fighting the war as a physical weapon. It might be helpful to understand the whole picture if we ask ourselves a few questions. Is it a coincidence that the US Air Force targeted 300 hectares of agricultural land covered in wheat crops in Syria back in 2020? What about the 3 million fruit trees uprooted by Israel since 2000 to displace Palestinians and damage their food sovereignty? Or the hundreds of acres of farmland destroyed in Sudan in 2013 as a result of heavy shooting? Let us not overlook how the sanctions imposed by EU countries on Russia restrict commercial flow between Russia and Africa intensifying the food crisis in numerous African countries, including Nigeria, Ethiopia, Sudan, and South Africa. Or how the US placed additional sanctions on Venezuela's food systems in 2019, reducing its ability to purchase food and resulting in food shortages across the nation. Is it a coincidence that most of the world's conflicts are concentrated in the global south? Is it also a coincidence that these regions are among the richest in terms of natural resources? And finally, why do these atrocious human rights violations continue to happen? The answer lies in the double standards of the global human rights system. The largest imperialist powers in the world, such as the US and EU, continue to exercise their influence in shaping the global food agenda, while continuing to instigate many wars that are starving millions of people, especially in the global south. Existing food and agricultural policies have conceptual and operational weaknesses and undermine local capacity and priorities by implementing externally driven interventions. These interventions have vested commercial, political, and institutional interests, resulting in the politicized or delayed delivery of assistance. A large portion of existing funding for food and agriculture support is not equitably distributed and is often conditional and subject to requirements that local communities are unable to meet. Furthermore, food assistance measures are designed and implemented in isolation and do not account for all dimensions of food security and nutrition. There is obviously a policy and institutional gap between humanitarian development and conflict resolution approaches. While a trendy concept, the humanitarian development peace nexus has emerged in an attempt to bridge this gap to better meet people's needs, mitigate risks and vulnerabilities, and advance towards achieving peace and justice, this concept is not effectively developed and implemented and therefore void of any real value. The triple nexus prioritizes short-term objectives above long-term ones, which can lead to dependency and discriminatory practices. It lacks specific plans and procedures to achieve coherence between these three pillars. And more importantly, the peace pillar is largely missing from policy and action. It is ambiguous in its treatment of underlying drivers and human rights obligations. Without addressing the underlying causes of conflict, the emphasis on the humanitarian and development pillar promotes short-term stability and reinforces existing imbalanced power relations that keep the people in subjugation. Examining the underlying causes of conflict and how they impact food insecurity has been stifled in international discussions, and political will is needed to restart the conversation. The world peace is fluid, therefore we need to define the components of the peace pillar. In addition to strengthening local food systems, we must prioritize upholding rights, including the right and access to justice. Only just peace will ensure durability, genuine reconciliation, social cohesion, and sustainable development. Moreover, we must enforce extraterritorial obligations, which are currently missing in the global human rights system. Third-party countries often provoke or sustain conflict for resource theft and to influence the strategic outcome in their favor and shape the world's geopolitical order. We need accountability mechanisms to hold these countries responsible. Unfortunately, some civil society organizations seem to forget their role as advocates for human rights and as contributors to the mediation and conflict resolution process. Instead, they choose to live off of these conflicts and the suffering of people benefiting from their continuation. To this end, the involvement of a united and free civil society is required to be the voice of the marginalized, to prioritize the needs of the affected communities and to reconfigure measures that are inefficient, unsustainable, and unequitable to ones that are context specific and rooted in country ownership and participation. Building resilience must enhance people's capacity to prevent crises and recover from them, not merely to prepare for or absorb them. Thank you so much.